Hey, what's up? Today we'll be talking about 5 tips to take better photos with your Leica SL2 or SL2S. My name is Lucas and I'm a photographer and filmmaker based out of West Michigan. Welcome to my channel. I just want to throw this out there as like a little stipulation. Most of these tips work with other camera systems, but I'll be diving deeper into a couple of settings on the Leica SL2 and Leica SL2S specifically that may not be available on every camera, but also might just be under a different name. But so this will be for the SL2 and the SL2S specifically. And bonus tip right off the bat, shoot in RAW. All of these tips are going to be under the assumption that you're already shooting in RAW and that you are planning on editing your photos, because that is going to be the #1 way to improve your photos if that's something that you are not doing. Straight out of camera is great, but you will get so much more information if you shoot RAW and expose to be editing your images. So let's jump right into it. So the first tip is to expose to the right. So that's a histogram phrase. When you're exposing for the right, you're putting all the information in the left and you're saving the right of the histogram, which is your highlights. Digital cameras are notoriously bad at retaining highlight information. I don't think Leica is alone on this issue, but they're definitely not leading the charge on highlight information retention. So there's a couple things that you can set on this camera that will help you retain those highlights and expose to the right. So the first one is going to be your metering. So I set my exposure metering to highlight weighted metering on both of my cameras, and they really don't change. I want to make sure that the brightest part of my image or my video is retained and not getting cut off, because I can bring shadows up almost all day with these cameras, but once the highlights clip just a little bit, it's totally nuked. And that's going to add a really bad blowout to your highlights and just look really not great. So there are moments where you're gonna have to break this rule and just expose for the subject. That's fine, but you need to be aware of it so that you can break it later. The next thing that I find really helpful is the auto ISO, setting that up. And that, I've never been a huge advocate for auto ISO because it's really just like, I like making all of the decisions, but these cameras with their auto ISO, it's so intelligent and so intuitive that I found it really nice to use, especially with that highlight weighted metering. So on my SL2, I'm okay with just getting the image to get the image. So I have my maximum ISO set to 12,500 on my SL2, and on my SL2S, I have it set to 25,000. So any situation, if I'm on auto ISO, I'm getting the shot. I don't want the camera to like not perform for me. So that is really helpful, especially coupled with highlight weighted metering. And then the last one is exposure compensation. So along with highlight weighted metering, along with auto ISO, I drop my exposure compensation to -1 stop. So I'm always underexposing by 1 stop and exposing for the highlights. That's going to give a dark image, but I'll be able to lift it in post and save the shadow details in most cases. So after that, we've got image stabilization. So I actually have image stabilization set as my bottom front button here. And the thing with image stabilization is it's so good on these cameras. I have shot images multiple seconds of shutter speed handheld, and they've not been blurry as long as the subject's not moving, and they look great. So highly recommend using image stabilization when you're doing handheld, when you're doing any type of work like that. But the reason I have this as a tip is because you can go in when you're adapting lenses, because not all of us are going to be using native lenses on these cameras or 6-bit encoded lenses on these cameras. But one of the things that you can do is you can go in and have lens profiles for the lenses that you actually have. So I have all of my M lenses and all of my R lenses pre-plugged in as lens profiles, and those I can just go in and pick, and the camera just will know. A lot of it's for metadata and for image stabilization. So when I'm photographing or filming something and I throw on my Leica R50 Summilux, it knows I have a 50 on here, I can stabilize for this. And then my metadata tells me this was shot with my 50 Summilux or my 100 Apo. That's super convenient. One thing is it's not going to do any corrections, contrast corrections or vignetting corrections. It needs that 6-bit encoded information to do those types of corrections, but metadata and image stabilization will be working if you have those plugged in there as well. So I think that that's really important. So the third tip is customize your wheels. I think you should customize everything on this camera to how you want it to be. I'm not saying that the way that I have it set up is the end all be all best way, because we are different people and we have different needs, right, with a camera. So for me, I have my thumb wheel set to aperture and I have my top wheel set to shutter speed. I have this for photo and video on both of my cameras, and I have both stop downs going to the right. So that just works for me, especially if I'm using the auto ISO, then I'm not adjusting ISO, but a lot of times I'm using manual ISO, and that is just this top button right here. But if you have that and you keep it consistent, your muscle memory will kick in and you'll be able to get your exposure locked in really quickly. And then your shutter type. So whether you want to accept it or not, your shutter type does play a large role in how your final image turns out. There is definitely shutter warp with the electronic shutter. And there's also some weird things that happen with video walls and projectors with the electronic shutter, but also the noise of your mechanical shutter can also be a hindrance as well, depending on the situation that you're in. So recognizing the limitations of both and then utilizing them as tools in certain situations to get the shot that you need. A lot of times I'm shooting somber moments and not wanting to be a hindrance or to distract from those moments. So I'll use the electronic shutter, but most of the time I'm not super worried about that. And also I just love the sound of the shutter. I mean, it's a beautiful sound, but that can take people out of the moment really easily. So recognizing when to use your electronic or your mechanical shutter. And then the last one is autofocus modes. This is, I would say, super important on these cameras because it's still in contrast detect autofocus, but I use two different modes on this camera. I use the spot mode, which gives me a little X in the middle of the screen, and then I use eye face body detection, and then I couple that with the IAF focusing. So not single point, not continuous, but it's their intelligent autofocus, which works really well. But I will say the reason I don't just keep it on eye face body detection is you're not gonna like get the shot every time with that. Sometimes you are shooting through something and it's not gonna catch that. So I bounce between the spot focus and the eye detect quite frequently, if I'm honest. By recognizing and utilizing both of those tools and practicing with them, you can really learn to get the photos that you need every time. And as we're talking about focusing, I'll throw in another bonus tip with that. This one's just kind of off the cuff, but in the manual focus setup, you can change the degrees of rotation that it takes. This is specific for Leica L lenses. It doesn't work on Sigma or Panasonic, but you can change from standard manual focus to any other rotation. So if you want it to be 360 degree rotation on the focus wheel, you can set it to that. And that helps, as well as you're dialing in focus on these cameras. But those are all the tips that I have for you today. The biggest thing is to just get out, use these cameras, and practice with them until they're muscle memory. So that's it for today. So please like and subscribe and leave any questions you have down in the comments. And I will see you in the next video.